There is a moment that arrives eventually in every relationship with a covert narcissist when the mask doesn't just slip, it falls away completely. And for the first time, you see the entire architecture of what you've actually been living inside of, clearly, undeniably, without the fog of doubt that used to soften every uncomfortable realization before you could fully register it. And in that moment, there's an instinct that rises up in almost everyone who reaches it. An instinct to confront, to expose, to finally say out loud everything you've been quietly cataloging for months or years, to force them to see themselves the way you've finally seen them. I understand that instinct completely. But today I want to talk about why, when you finally expose a covert narcissist for who they actually are, the wisest, most self-protective thing you can do is not stay to watch the confrontation unfold. It's to leave quietly, and I want to walk you through exactly why that is, because it runs counter to almost every emotional instinct you'll feel in that moment. To understand why quiet departure matters so much more than confrontation, you first have to understand what makes a covert narcissist fundamentally different from the more overt, obvious version most people picture when they hear the word narcissist. Overt narcissism tends to be loud, grandiose, easy to spot from a distance. The person who dominates every conversation, who needs visible admiration, who reacts to criticism with obvious defensiveness or aggression. Covert narcissism operates almost entirely in the opposite register. It hides behind humility, behind self-deprecation, behind an image of being the quiet, long-suffering, misunderstood one. A covert narcissist doesn't announce their need for admiration. They extract it through sympathy, through carefully curated victimhood, through a persistent narrative in which they are always, somehow, the one who has been wronged, overlooked, or underappreciated, regardless of what actually happened. This makes them exceptionally difficult to identify, because their manipulation doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like sensitivity. It looks like woundedness. It looks, convincingly, like exactly the kind of person who deserves your patience and your compassion, which is precisely why so many people stay entangled with them for years before the pattern becomes undeniable. This is exactly why exposure, the moment you finally articulate the pattern clearly, whether to them directly or to people around you, represents such a unique kind of danger, one that's different from what happens when you confront an overt narcissist. An overt narcissist, when confronted, often responds with something at least recognizable as anger, as denial, as an obvious defensive reaction that, however unpleasant, is at least legible for what it is. A covert narcissist responds very differently, and understanding this difference is exactly why leaving quietly matters so much. When you expose a covert narcissist, you are threatening the single most important asset they've spent years, sometimes decades, carefully constructing their image as the reasonable, sympathetic, misunderstood party. This image isn't incidental to their psychology. It's central to it because covert narcissism often develops specifically as a strategy for people who learned early in life that overt demands for admiration were met with punishment or rejection, while quiet, sympathetic victimhood reliably generated care and attention instead. Threatening that carefully built image doesn't just threaten their reputation, it threatens the core survival strategy their entire adult identity has been built around. The first reason to leave quietly, rather than staying to confront or explain, is that a covert narcissist facing exposure will almost always pivot immediately into a specific, predictable tactic, reversing the narrative so that you become the aggressor and they become the victim of your supposed cruelty, instability, or unfairness. This isn't a rare, occasional response. It's close to a psychological inevitability because their entire identity depends on maintaining the sympathetic position, and exposure represents the single greatest threat to that position they're likely to encounter. The moment you clearly, calmly name the pattern you've observed, you should expect, almost immediately, some version of the following: tears, expressions of devastation at being so misunderstood, references to how hard they've tried, how much they've sacrificed, how hurtful it is that after everything you'd characterize them this way. This reversal isn't necessarily fully conscious manipulation in every instance. Some covert narcissists have become so practiced at this reflex that they genuinely experience themselves as the wounded party in the moment, which makes the performance even more convincing to anyone watching, including sometimes people who know both of you and are now being pulled into a narrative where your accurate observation gets recast as your cruelty. This is precisely why staying to argue your case, to defend your perception, to insist on being heard and validated in the moment of exposure almost never produces the outcome you're hoping for. You are not, in this moment, dealing with someone who is capable of receiving accurate feedback about their behavior and adjusting accordingly. You are dealing with someone whose entire psychological structure is organized specifically to prevent that kind of reception, because absorbing accountability would require dismantling the exact identity that's protected them from an even more painful reality they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Staying to argue doesn't create a breakthrough. It creates an audience for the counter-narrative they're about to construct. And worse, it creates additional material. Your visible frustration, your raised voice, your understandable but exploitable emotional reaction. That gets folded directly into that counter-narrative as further evidence of your instability rather than their pattern. The second reason to leave quietly involves something that's genuinely difficult to accept in the moment, but becomes clearer with distance. You do not actually need them to acknowledge what you saw in order for what you saw to be true. This might sound obvious stated plainly, but in the emotional intensity of finally naming a pattern you've been living inside of for months or years, the desire for acknowledgement becomes enormously powerful, almost consuming. There's a specific kind of validation that feels like it should be available in this moment. Surely, you think, if I explain this clearly enough, if I lay out the pattern with enough evidence, enough specific examples, enough undeniable logic, they'll finally have to see it too. But this hope, however understandable, misunderstands what you're actually dealing with. Their inability to acknowledge the pattern isn't a failure of your explanation. It's a structural feature of their psychology, and no version of your explanation, however clear, however patient, however well evidenced, is going to override a defense system that has been protecting them from exactly this kind of acknowledgement for their entire adult life. Waiting for that acknowledgement before you leave keeps you tethered to an outcome that isn't coming, and every moment spent waiting for it is a moment spent in continued exposure to the exact dynamic you're trying to exit. The third reason, and this one deserves real, honest attention, is that staying to confront a covert narcissist after exposure puts you at significant risk of what's sometimes called reputational preemption, their rapid mobilization of mutual friends, family members, or community relationships to establish their version of events before you've had the chance or even the desire to tell your own. Covert narcissists are often remarkably skilled at this specific maneuver, precisely because they've spent years cultivating sympathy and goodwill with the people around them, goodwill you may not have realized was being strategically built the entire time you were focused on the relationship itself rather than its surrounding social ecosystem. The moment they sense exposure is coming, or has already happened, this network becomes activated, often within hours, with a version of events carefully calibrated to preserve their sympathetic image, while recasting you as unreasonable, unstable, or cruel. Staying to fight this narrative in real time, trying to correct the record as it's actively being written by someone with a significant head start and years of relationship capital you don't have access to, is an exhausting, often unwinnable battle, one that keeps you enmeshed in their orbit precisely when your energy would be far better spent building distance instead. The fourth reason involves protecting your own nervous system from an experience that, if you've been in this dynamic long enough, is probably already deeply familiar to you. The specific disorientation of watching someone weaponize your own accurate perception against you, in real time with an audience. This experience, sometimes described as a particularly acute form of gaslighting, is genuinely destabilizing even for people who feel confident in what they witnessed, because there's something uniquely disorienting about watching your own clear-eyed observation get transformed in real time into evidence of your own cruelty or instability. This isn't a battle you need to fight in order to validate your own experience. Your experience was valid the moment you lived it, regardless of whether they or anyone watching the confrontation ultimately agrees with your account of it. The fifth reason, and perhaps the most practically important, is that quiet departure denies a covert narcissist the one resource their entire counter strategy depends on, an ongoing conflict to manage, respond to, and narrate. Confrontation, dramatic as it might feel in the moment, actually gives them exactly what their psychology is best equipped to handle. An active situation they can perform victimhood within, generate sympathy around, and use as material for ongoing narrative construction. Quiet departure offers none of this. There's no dramatic scene to reference, no visible conflict to point to as evidence of your instability, simply an absence that's much harder to spin into a compelling story, precisely because stories require content, and your quiet, undramatic exit gives them remarkably little to work with. Quiet departure offers none of this. There's no dramatic scene to reference, no visible conflict to point to as evidence of your instability, simply an absence that's much harder to spin into a compelling story precisely because stories require content, and your quiet, undramatic exit gives them remarkably little to work with. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding why quiet departure matters strategically is only part of the picture. The other part, the part that actually determines whether this decision serves your long-term healing, is understanding how to actually execute it, what to expect in the aftermath, and how to hold your own certainty steady, even when everything around you seems designed to make you doubt it. The first thing to understand about actually leaving quietly is that quiet doesn't mean secretive, and it doesn't mean dishonest. This distinction matters enormously because some people, hearing this advice, worry that leaving quietly means abandoning their own integrity, sneaking away as though they've done something wrong rather than simply exiting a dynamic that was never sustainable. Quiet departure isn't about hiding. It's about refusing to hand over the specific performance a covert narcissist needs in order to execute their usual counter-strategy. You can be completely honest about why you're leaving with the people who genuinely matter to you, without needing to stage that honesty as a public confrontation designed to force acknowledgement from the one person who was never going to offer it genuinely anyway. There's a real difference between telling your closest friend, calmly, honestly, "I've realized this relationship was built on a pattern I can no longer accept," and staging a dramatic exposure designed to make the narcissist finally see themselves clearly in front of an audience. The first is honest self-protection. The second, however emotionally satisfying it might feel in the moment of imagining it, almost always backfires in exactly the ways we discussed. The second thing to understand is how to prepare yourself, realistically, for what happens in the immediate aftermath of a quiet departure, because even the wisest exit doesn't fully protect you from an uncomfortable period of watching the narrative reconstruction happen from a distance. You will likely at some point hear versions of events that don't match what actually happened. You may hear that you were unstable, that you overreacted, that you were always the difficult one in the relationship, that they tried everything to make it work with someone who simply couldn't be satisfied. This will be painful to encounter, especially if it reaches you through mutual friends or family members who seem to be accepting this reconstructed version at face value. But I want you to hold on to something important during this period. Their narrative reconstruction is not evidence that your original perception was wrong. It's simply confirmation of exactly the pattern you identified in the first place, playing out precisely the way covert narcissistic defense mechanisms are designed to play out. The people who eventually see through that reconstruction, who take the time to actually notice inconsistencies in a story that doesn't quite add up, who remember their own observations from before you left that contradict the version now being presented. Those people will find their way to a clearer understanding eventually on their own timeline, without you needing to fight for it in real time. The third thing worth understanding is the specific grief that comes with this kind of exit, because it's different from the grief of leaving an overtly difficult relationship, and it deserves its own honest attention. Leaving a covert narcissist quietly often means grieving not just the relationship itself, but the acknowledgement you'll likely never receive, the apology that was never actually coming, even though some part of you kept hoping it might eventually arrive if you just explained things clearly enough. This is a particular kind of unresolved grief, one without the closure that comes from an admission of wrongdoing, and I want you to understand that this lack of closure doesn't mean your healing has to remain incomplete. Closure was never actually something someone else could give you in the first place, not really. Genuine closure comes from your own internal certainty about what happened, not from their external validation of it, and building that internal certainty, independent of whether they ever confirm it, is actually one of the most important parts of healing from this specific kind of relationship. The fourth thing to understand, and this one requires real patience, is that the specific discomfort of watching someone else's version of events circulate, unchallenged, in real time, tends to fade with distance in a way that's genuinely difficult to believe while you're still inside the immediate aftermath. In the first weeks and months, it can feel unbearable, almost unjust, that they get to control the narrative while you've chosen silence as your form of self-protection. But as time passes, and as your own life continues to develop distance from the relationship, something important happens. The narrative they've constructed starts to matter less, not because it's been corrected, but because your own life, your own healing, your own growing clarity about what actually happened becomes the more relevant, more present reality you're actually living inside of. Their story about you becomes something that exists primarily in a chapter of your life you're no longer standing inside of, while your actual life, the one you're building now, becomes the story that matters most. The fifth thing, and this might be the most important reframe of everything we've discussed today, is understanding what leaving quietly actually protects. Beyond just your reputation or your energy in the immediate aftermath, it protects something deeper and more permanent, your own relationship with your own perception, your own certainty, your own hard-won clarity about a pattern you spent considerable time learning to see accurately, despite every mechanism designed to keep you doubting it. Staying to fight for acknowledgement risks re-entangling that clarity in exactly the kind of confusion and doubt you worked so hard to move beyond in the first place. Every moment spent arguing your case to someone whose entire psychology is organized around not receiving it is a moment where your own certainty is vulnerable to erosion, where the fog you finally cleared has an opportunity to creep back in, disguised as one more attempt at being understood. Leaving quietly protects the clarity itself, preserves it intact, keeps it from being diluted by an exchange that was never going to honor it anyway. I want to say something directly now to anyone listening who is standing at exactly this threshold, who has finally seen the pattern clearly, who feels the powerful pull toward confrontation, toward exposure, toward making them finally understand what they've actually done. I understand that pull completely, and I'm not asking you to pretend it isn't there. But I want you to consider something before you act on it. The version of you standing in this moment of clarity, the one who finally sees the entire architecture clearly, doesn't need their acknowledgement to validate what she already knows. She has already done the hardest part. She has already seen through years of careful construction, years of sympathetic performance, years of narrative designed specifically to prevent this exact moment of clarity from ever arriving. That achievement is entirely hers, entirely complete, entirely independent of whether the person who built that construction ever admits what she's finally, fully seen. So picture this. One final time, the way we often close these conversations, not a dramatic confrontation, not a tearful scene where the mask finally, publicly, falls away in front of witnesses who finally understand, but something quieter, something far more powerful in its own restrained way. Picture her, closing a door behind her, gently, without slamming it, without needing anyone standing on the other side to fully understand why she's closing it. Picture her walking away not in anger, not in a rush of dramatic vindication, but in a kind of settled, hard-won calm, carrying with her the one thing that actually matters, not his acknowledgement, which was never coming, but her own unshakable knowledge of exactly what she lived through and exactly why she finally, quietly, chose to leave. Because that is the real cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. The loudest, most powerful thing you can do when you finally expose a covert narcissist isn't a confrontation that gives them exactly the material they need to rebuild their narrative in real time. It's silence. It's distance. It's the quiet, unshakable certainty of someone who no longer needs an audience, no longer needs an admission, no longer needs anything at all from the person she's leaving behind, because she has already given herself the one thing that actually matters. The truth, fully seen, fully hers, and finally permanently, no longer up for negotiation with anyone who was never capable of receiving it honestly in the first place.